So good evening, everyone. And if you hear a slight noise in the background, it's that my men who cut my lawn decided to show up about 2 minutes ago, and they're all over the backyard next to my office here. So they should be gone shortly. But in any event, we're going to talk tonight about something I should have known about very early in my life, and we'll talk about that, and only found out about really and got to study in any depth in the last several years. And it was the Battle of Navesink. And of course, the question mark there is about where this happened. And we're going to talk about it tonight. It's one of these really, I think, important things that happened during the Revolutionary War in 1777, pretty early in the war, that somehow had been overlooked, as so much of our local history has been. So here's my attempt to bring that to the fore for you. You could see a New York Times headline to an article that was published actually in 1896 about the Battle of Navesink. And I had held on to this article that I ran across sometime for years. I did not read it in its original form in 1896. But when I started to look into this battle a little bit more closely, I got very, very interested in that particular article, which is here. And I know you can't read it. But you can see some highlights right there. Of course, the map on the left on the first page of the article is Monmouth County. Sandy Hook's pretty prominent. And if you can or cannot read it, the little image to the right says Hartshorn's Cove. But it says Long Point. We'll talk about why that's a mistake. But mysteriously to me, when I looked over the article, it was written by this person, M.C. Murray Hyde, in 1896. And it's a pretty in-depth article, as you can see, about something that had happened that year. And it turns out that this M.C. Murray Hyde person also followed up in July in a then extant magazine with a slightly different version of this story. And there were some contradictions in it when I read that online as well, which led me to call this a mystery, as you'll see in a few minutes. And so one of the first things I did, as I always do, is I went over to Freehold, 70 Court Street, and Dana went down into the archives and brought back the folder of this person. And I found the original drawing that appeared in the New York Times that M.C. Murray Hyde had actually sketched. And I saw right away there was a mistake, because in the original it says the Highlands from above Long Point. And when that got translated into newspaper print, it said the Highlands from above at Hartshorn's Cove Long Point. So that got me to thinking that there might be some other things that I should look into, which I did, and we'll talk about. So just to give you an orientation, here's an aerial view, of course, of what you and I now call Hartshorn's Woods. This is Long Point on the Rumson Peninsula. It's a separate entity across the Navesink, of course. And here's Hartshorn's Cove, right over there, and what I used to call Top of the East on the other side of the hill. And way in the background, you can see Sandy Hook. So we're going to talk about things that happened all along this area tonight. And although you can't see it in the original drawing, there's an image of a house here that plays very much into this story. It's in the background, and we'll get to why that's important. So my first question is, and when I blew up this signature in this newspaper, who was M.C. Murray Hyde? And lo and behold, it turned out to be Mary Crawford Murray Hyde. They're pictured, who is a very famous historian, probably thought of herself as an amateur historian in those days, but I highlighted her middle name. She married a Dr. Hyde, so that's her full name at the point of her writing. But as you can see, and if you know Monmouth County history, she is a descendant of some very, very famous families, which is why I believe she spent a large portion of her life searching and researching and writing about Monmouth County history. And she's got some real good cred, all right? She's the great-great-granddaughter of one of the militiamen, James W. Cooper, who was captured at this battle we're going to discuss in 1777. So she knew it from the inside, if you will. She was also the great granddaughter of a guy named Joseph Murray, who a lot of you will recognize because he was another militiaman murdered by the Tory loyalists in June of 1870, a few years after this battle, of course. And that occurred in Middletown, right there on his farm. And the story that she wrote about, and others have written about since, is that he was a militiaman home on leave, and he had put his musket down against a farm fence. And right about there, as he was plowing his field, some loyalists came up and shot him dead, um, just a few yards away from his house, pictured as it may have looked then. But you will all recognize it for its current iteration because it's the Forestry Park house that's obviously been built on a few years. So Mary Crawford, Murray Hyde, has a lot of legitimacy in her researches. I've been pleased to have copies of her original letters to another famous Monmouth County historian named Beekman, which name I know you know. And so I got to look into her thinking. But let's go back to the incident she wrote about, February 13th, 77. We're into the Revolutionary War, a year and a half or 2 years almost, and things have rapidly changed. Monmouth County is a mess, if you will. It's about to get messier because it's going to be a civil war, families against families, neighbors against neighbors, and all that goes with that. So here's a blow up of that picture that she had in the article. And the story is the following, that Colonel Nathaniel Scudder of the Monmouth Militia learned that a victualizing ship, a supply ship basically, a British supply ship that had been captured and under duress their French captain had been kept aboard, had wrecked on the beach in roughly Seabright, Monmouth Beach. And so he, Nathaniel Scudder, goes from Black Point over here in the Rumson Peninsula with some militiamen to go loot this ship. They actually start to do that. They free the French captain, who disappears from history, unfortunately. And then the British, in a few days here, this is going on, and they decide to move against this operation. So the first point is where the shipwreck was. That's what launched this battle. And two groups of British show up, and they come down from Staten Island in a large ship. And the first group are made up of new levies, so-called. And these are basically new draftees that the British have taken under their wing. And they are assigned to go down in the ship and commandeer the ship back, the wrecked ship, and take as many captives from the militia as they can. And they do that. And they're also accompanied on that ship by, and I love this name, the 26th Regiment of Foot, the professional British Army, and they are assigned to go in and assault Quartermaster Richard Hartshorn's house, which is on the inland side of the Barrier Beach Peninsula. And that's about there where Richard Hartshorn lived. And this is a complete disaster for the Monmouth militia. 25 of the militiamen are killed during the engagement. 40 escape into the woods. Some of them die in the woods, and probably their remains are buried there somewhere. And worst of all, maybe, is that 72 of the militiamen are taken prisoners of war by the British, and you'll see in a few minutes what happens to them. And the British lose entirely one man. So it's absolutely a rout. And as my friend Randy Gabriel pointed out to me, to call it a battle, which it has been called over the years, is probably a stretch because there was not much of a battle. The British surprised the militia. You can see the results of the surprise, and there was very little resistance. A lot of them ran off who weren't escapees. And so I think Randy's probably right in calling it more of a skirmish. Nonetheless, it's important for reasons that we'll discuss. The first question I had when I read the accounts that Mary had written was that for Richard Hartshorn's house, this arrow that I drew to about where the shipwreck was would have been a hard thing, would have lacked visibility. And I'll show you what I mean by that. This is a picture I took when I was kayaking last summer of Hartshorn's Cove, okay, right here. And if you look on this side, this is the Rumson, Fairhaven Peninsula, clearly Rumson down at this end. And that house that I had mentioned before, the original Hartshorn House, not the Portland Manor House today, was right about there. And there's no way anybody could see across to the shipwreck, which is allegedly how the militia discovered it was on the shore. So that brought up a problem. There I superimpose the image of this very, very minimal house that Richard Hartshorn had built, a couple of decades before this battle. So let's talk about what Murray Hyde said at the point. Here is obviously a much more modern map. That's about where she had the shipwreck right off, probably close to where the Seabright, what I call the Seabright Bridge is, that's being reconstructed now. Here is Hartshorn's Woods, of course. And there's a couple of other things that she said. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate her wonderful research and her knowledge, but she certainly didn't have the resources that we have today. Obviously, she didn't have the internet. She was living in New York for a lot of her life when she was married. And although I'm sure she visited many of the libraries and archives and probably family members down here, she wasn't as mobile as we can be via the internet to find out things. And many things hadn't been published that have been in the meantime. So I had the benefit of hindsight and of looking at newer research that she did not have available. But in any event, one of the things she alleges in her article that Captain Roger Morris, one of those Tories who took over the shipwreck, belonged to the Lewis Morris family from Passage Point. And you might recall that Passage Point was right here because over the centuries, there has been a series of inlets here wherein people could make the passage from the Navesink River or the Shrewsbury directly to the ocean and then New York, wherever they were going. And so she assumed that because one of the Lewis Morrises, who was murdered, by the way, in Passage Point in 1795, or I should say 1695, was of the same family. And it's a nit, but it's an important one, as you'll see later. It turns out that this Roger Morris is from a different branch of the family, from Yorkshire, whereas Lewis Morris and all of those Morrises that were around here were from Wales, so an entirely different family. She also mentioned several times, or at least the first time, that the militia assembled here at Richard Hartshorn's house, which again is on the inside of the Navesink River Basin over here. And you can even see from this map, there would have been no clear view for them to see the shipwreck, nor the British the opposite way. She also says that Major Andrew Gordon, who had these British professional troops, entered the mouth of the Navesink River and landed near Island Beach. Now she's writing in 1896 at the location of then, she calls them the Twin Beacons. So there's Island Beach. And today, if you go there, if you sit in bars and restaurant and look across, you'll see Island Beach, but it's now a peninsula attached to Sandy Hook. And so what it sounded to me like she was saying that the British ship must have come down this way, gone through the inlet, and then gone up to Island Beach. And that didn't make sense to me. Why would they do that if Richard Hartshorn's house is here where the militia is assembled? So that was the first problem that I saw. The Twin Beacons, by the way, were right about there. Okay. So what I did next was to look at a little bit more closely at her writing, and she sort of hedges, or at least maybe she had second thoughts, because in that second article she wrote, she said the British landed and proceeded about a mile further to the house of one Hartshorn. So suddenly she's not so sure it's Richard Hartshorn. She's calling it, probably describing it from something she had read. So that raised a question, because there happened to be on the other side of this Hartshorn Wood Peninsula that the family owned for years, the brother of Robert Hartshorn, who we'll talk about in a second, named Esek Hartshorn. And so that made a little bit more sense to me as a possible location, because she also writes that the British landed about 2 miles below the rebel posts, wading up to their base onto waist on the beach at Highlands, about 1 mile west. And then she goes back to say Richard Hartshorn's house. So if they landed here in Highlands anywhere, 1 mile west could be Richard Hartshorn's, but wading up to their waists on the beach and then walking 2 miles didn't make sense to me, even though, of course, the geography has changed somewhat in the intervening years. So that suggested that maybe she thought the British came down the inner route through the Shrewsbury here and then came up the Navesink. And that creates a couple of other problems that we're going to talk about. And the problems I'm related to are my trying to discern what it was actually going on here. So another old map of the more revolutionary map time frame of what's going on there. Here again is the Rumson Peninsula. That would be about where Isaac Hartshorn's house was and where Richard Hartshorn's house was. Island Beach would have been right there. So General Howe, the British commander in New York, says that a considerable number of rebels having appeared on the heights above the lighthouse. Now, the lighthouse on Sandy Hook was built in 1746, and at the time it was at the very tip of Sandy Hook. Now it's a mile or more from there because of the literal drift of sand. So if the rebels, meaning the militia, are on the heights above Sandy Hook, and they're there for good reason, they want to see British shipping coming and going through this area where they would dock sometimes or outside, so they could gain some intelligence about what the British were trying to do. They couldn't have been here, because those of you that are local to the geography know that this is a big hill. It's a 220-foot high hill, highest on the East Coast, on the coast directly. And from this side, Richard Hartshorn's side, you can't see any of this. But from Isaac Hartshorn's side and the hills on the Highlands, you have a perfectly good view, which is why the militia would want to be there. So that was a clue to me. The other clue to its real location was that she talks about, from another record, that the British were piloted by a Maclise who thoroughly knew the shoals and channels. And again, those of you who know the geography, there's a Maclise Creek here. And whichever Maclise this was, who apparently was a turncoat, who was a sometimes sympathizer with the patriotic rebels, and in this case, helped the British, he knew the shoals that were in this part of the Navesink River. Now you see here, there are a couple of inlets over time that connect the Navesink and, of course, the Shrewsbury to the open ocean. And a couple of these are familiar names even today, right? Rocky Point today, they called it Rock Point here. Black Point has always been referred to as this part of Rumson, and Jumping Point, I'm sure you know that name too. So the fact that Maclise is helping them in here says to me, he's probably not helping them up here. So something's amiss. And so I decide that, and I'll show you more proof, that the British must have come down this way, come through the inlet here, below this inlet, which was up here, by the way, and attack the militiamen on the other side of the peninsula. So I got in my little kayak this summer and went to one of these sedge islands not shown on this map, probably about here. And I took this picture, and this is Rocky Point. Okay, that is the southeastmost easternmost part of what is Hartshorn's Woods. Okay, and you can even see Seabright here in the background. The other thing that caught my attention was one of the write-ups to this report says that the militia guard was posted about 200 yards from the house, meaning the Hartshorn house, and they were first alarmed, the guard. They fired a few shots, and then they take off, and then the entire battalion or the entire militia runs away. And I thought, wait a minute, if they're here at Richard Hartshorn's house, there's no way the British are surprising them because they would have to walk along this very, very narrow shoreline here. They're going to be making a lot of noise. And if they try to land upriver, they're going to be spotted by the militia here. And if the militia comes this way, which would have been about 2 miles from Rocky Point, there's no element of surprise. So again, that didn't make sense to me. So I discounted the fact that the British would have come inland too to get to Island Beach because they would have been seen on this side from this lookout point. Okay, so follow me here, if you will, back about 20 years earlier. This is a map of a survey that was done when Esek and his brother Robert Hartshorn, the grandsons of that guy, the original Richard Hartshorn, when their father William dies, they split the property. Now, what is not on this survey is Sandy Hook, which would have been right here where the compass arrow is. But suffice it to say that Esek got the kind of northeasternmost part of the property, and his brother Robert gets the southwest, if you will. Here's Rocky Point down here. Okay, so they split the property and they have joint control, as it turns out, of Sandy Hook. And this is important for me to discover where this battle went. And oh, by the way, I grew up spending my summers in Highlands. And when I was a kid, and a lot of people still do, everybody called it Hartshorn's Woods. But the original family name is Hartshorn. Those of you who saw me talk about my English adventure last year when I went to the original town where they were from, Lathern in Great Britain. And you can see from their family crest that a hart to the English people is a stag. And there it is, and also 3 times on the crest. And their motto was Tout Press, which means always ready. Okay, so their pronunciation, no matter how we say it, was Hart's Horn, because it's the horn of a stag. Okay, that trivia aside, I got extremely lucky, and we're all actually lucky, to have the same year this battle happened, what was called a headland view, a sketch of the very territory we're involved in here was done. And the backstory of this is that the British, aside from being the world's greatest maritime power, after they had defeated the Dutch in the late 18th century, not only did they have a superior set of charts, they also had artists on their ships with their fleet captains and commanders all over the world drawing, as you see here, what they call landfall and headland views, so that people coming into this harbor with their ships for the first time would not only see on the map where they were, but they'd get a lay of the land literally. And this one was created, or at least published in 1777, so I imagine it was drawn the year before. And as you can see, 2 very prominent things are shown here. There's the famous lighthouse at Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook appears from this view to be an island, right? And here is the Highlands, as we know it now. And this would be, of course, Sandy Hook Bay. But when I looked at this a little bit more closely than you can on your screens, I noticed what I think was what looks to me, and I want it to be, Esek Hartshorn's house. There's something very, very prominent on the side of the hill there in this blow-up image. And that would make perfect sense for anybody who wanted a beautiful vista view of the harbor, and also for a militiaman or troops who wanted to see what the British are doing here. Once again, another map showing how frequently these inlets occurred along our coast. You can see at this point, when this map was done in the, I think, 1760s, the lighthouse is there. Sandy Hook is definitely an island. There's an inlet here. There's an inlet here. There's an inlet here. And so this was frequently happening. And also a kind of a neat notation that opening made here in 1778, which is after this battle. So that ruled out to me that that particular inlet was existing. And so that image I showed you probably included the peninsula all the way down to here. And remarkably, again, at the Monmouth County Historical Association, my favorite toy store away from home, I uncovered in the Hartshorn files these handwritten notes, one by a guy named Andrew Bound, sure you know that name, who talks about an inlet opening after a storm in 1746-47. And here in probably Robert Hartshorn's own hands, in 1756, he describes another breakthrough. So recall, of course, in those days that the barrier beaches along our coast, which hadn't been hardened by jetties and groins and all the things we have today, there were frequent, including during Hurricane Sandy not that long ago, breakthroughs where the ocean would create inlets. And they were convenient to a certain extent at the time. If you're shipping, I don't know, iron from the Tinton Falls iron mill down the Navesink or up the Navesink into the ocean in New York and beyond. So we have definite proof that these things are going on. So let's talk about the battle a little bit. The British leave a place called Corliss Ferry in Staten Island with a very, very prominent ship called the Siren, or possibly the Sirene, 28-gun brig. And they're coming down here to try to recapture this shipwreck and also disrupt the militia along the coast. I need you to recall something, that in the early days of the Revolutionary War, the British are in Philadelphia until 1778, which eventuates the Battle of Monmouth, and also they're in New York primarily. This territory here that we all live and love, Monmouth County, is only sporadically controlled by the British. The militia who are trying to defend their, farms and families are more in control than happens later on. As I mentioned, the 26th Regiment of Foot, Scottish regiment, comes down, and in one of the great ironies of history to me, Major Andrew Gordon, after the war, which he survives, winds up being Lieutenant Governor of the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel, after which, by the way, our state is named. Story for another time. Here's a picture of Roger Morris, who was the captain that Mary Hyde talked about, who was in charge of these Tory new recruits, basically, whose job it was to take over the shipwreck. Gordon and his regiment of foot are going to confront the militia. So we know that they left from there, from their own writings, probably a half-a-day journey with favorable winds. I don't know if any of you who have boats have been out here, and I have many times. The so-called East Bank, and also here, even today, is called the False Hook. The way you get into New York Harbor or out of New York Harbor is two ways. You can go this way. Now, actually, there's a big dredge channel here. But in those days, you only had the inside route here because it's very shoal here, or you could go outside. So that's the way they came down. Now, let's talk about what happens. Here is that map of Hartshorn's Woods, and here is Sandy Hook, as you can see, and they continue it here. But that gives you a lay of the land, and you'll see here it says William Hartshorn. William is Robert Essex's father, the son of Richard. So we know from their reports that the Redcoats trudged through the snow in two flanking lines. Now, the first thing that I said to myself is, all right, if they land at Rocky Point, okay, and by the way, they wouldn't have made it in there on the Siren. They would have had to disembark into smaller whale boats because it was pretty shoal, as you already know in here. But if they do that, A, they're going to make a lot of noise, and now they're going to be trudging through snow. There was a big February snowstorm that paralyzed most of the coast, and especially the Monmouth County and New York area, a couple of weeks before this battle. So if they land here and they start coming toward Quartermaster Richard Hartshorn's house, they're going to make a lot of noise. And also, the woods come right down, even today, as you know, to the coast. They don't have a lot of maneuvering room, which is going to cause problems. If they instead come inland and land here, then they've got to go across McLeese Creek, or I should say Clay Pit Creek, and come across a little beach here, and they're going to make a lot of noise, and everybody here is going to hear them again. So there's no way that they landed and attacked Richard Hartshorn's house. There was no surprise if they did that. And either the militia would have fled earlier without all the casualties, or they would have defended themselves a lot more readily. And I think what happened, again, in the research that had been done previously, was that there were a number of Richard Hartshorns. The quartermaster, we know, okay, here is Robert's son. We know he lived here for a while. I'm sorry, not Robert's son, his nephew. Robert's son, Richard, was alive in that period of time during this as well. And Isak up here, who lives up on the other side, he has a son, although this son is too young to have been part of the battle. Maybe he saw it, but he certainly wasn't a militiaman. And I don't think anybody would have called this house Richard Hartshorn's house. So there's a confusion in the names. However, what made more sense to me, and I think you'll see as I go on, that when the British landed here at Rocky Point, the militia assembled on the other side of Hartshorn's woods would not have seen them when they landed in the early morning or overnight, perhaps. And as the report said, that they came up trudging through the snow in the woods at night and then create two flanking lines. It would have been the last minute where some outposted guard here would have heard or seen them, and it would have been too late to do anything. Hence, they flee and get captured. And as you already know, it was a disaster. 25 killed, 72 captured, at least 40 escape into the woods, some of whom die there. And the British, again, only lost one man, completely surprising the militiamen. And we're lucky in this sense that the colonel who was in charge of the militia, although not at the battle, David Foreman, who you may know as Black David, so called by the British because he was a brutal fighter, quite famous in Monmouth County history, and ruthless. But he accumulates, actually for purposes of pension and pay later, and a list of all the escape, or I should say the POWs, and there's 72 of them. And what happens is when they get captured by the British, they get transported back to New York and taken to the old sugar house, where they are imprisoned under horrible conditions for at least the next 10 months or so, 8 or 9 months maybe. And the house that I think they're talking about is the Livingston Sugar House. There were other sugar houses, which were, as they sound, storage houses that prominent British colonial families stored mostly Barbadian sugar before they refined it and sent it on its way to both Europe and the colonies. And the British during the war converted these big, substantial houses, I should say, to prisons. And they underfed prisoners, and they were horrible. And many, including men on this list, Monmouth militiamen, died while they were in prison. And what's interesting is when I looked at the list and tried to find out as much as I could about many of these men, you see some very famous Monmouth County names that you're all familiar with, including Murray Hyde's second great-grandfather, James Cooper here. You know the name Burroughs from the Burroughs Mansion in Matawan, Smock, of course, the Holmes family, and the rest. And as you can see, too, it's a combination of British and Dutch names. And through it all, when I tried to do research to these individuals, a couple of things struck me. And one of which is that what we mostly have of the men who survived the imprisonment and made it back somehow to Monmouth County, we mostly know where they were buried. You know, these are common yeoman farmers by and large, with the exception of the officer corps. And so, for instance, James Morris is buried down in Leonardo. He's one of the POWs. He obviously lived through that horror and made his life after the war. And we have his gravestone and a number of other gravestones of some of these men that made it back to Monmouth County. And we have images of only 3 other people involved in this battle. And as you would suspect, they're men in the first 2 cases, because in those days, you know, first of all, men were predominant, okay? And if you were a famous or a rich man or a well-connected man, you would have your portrait done or your painting done. So, for instance, we have several images of David Foreman shown down there. Joseph Stilwell, another old Monmouth name of Dutch origin, actually, comes from the Monmouth County Historic Association once again. This picture of him with what I think is the inspiration for the Coneheads haircut. But we have one other image, and this was really startling, at least that I could find. And if anybody has more, I'd love to see them. And the only other image we have of people at this battle is this woman. Betty Dorn, taken obviously sketched much, much later in her life, was a 17-year-old enslaved woman, a black woman enslaved to Eichharthorn. And for some reason unknown to me, late in her life, the family, and she's liberated at that point, manumitted, late in her life, decide that this valued servant and friend of the family is worthy of an artist's sketch. And it was remarkable that it somehow survived, and there it is. And of course, very few, except again, prominent families in the Monmouth County Historic Association collections, pictures exist of women. So it's kind of neat that we have that. Just to give you a little brief overview of what the British were doing, they had any number of jails spelled the old way in some cases. Notoriously, the Provost Jail, about where City Hall today is. There's some dispute whether or not all these others, the Van Cortlands and the Rhinelanders, sugar houses, were actually ever converted, because a lot of times we get references to the Sugar House Jail, but we're pretty convinced that Livingston's was the one that the Monmouth, or I should say the Navesink prisoners were held in. And notoriously too, and in another irony, in Wallabout Bay here on the Brooklyn side of the East River, the prison ship Jersey, which had the most horrendous conditions. There's been books written about it that I would recommend, but only before you eat dinner, because it's horrible the way people were treated on this old ship that had been converted to a prison ship in the harbor. And over years, many colonial, not just New Jersey, patriotic rebels and militiamen died there. And there's this, as you can see, a monument that was put up on the Brooklyn side. So the British were very angry about the whole rebellion, as you would expect, and their cruelty, particularly at the Provost Jail with a man named Cunningham, was particularly unnerving when you read about it. But another story for another time. So my search to find out where Eichharthorn's house, which at the point in my research I was pretty sure where the battle happened, involved going into the old deeds. I knew that Richard Hartshorn way back had been granted the property by the East Jersey proprietors back in 1670. And I tracked it all the way down through 1870 and saw all the changes and what people paid, and watched the famous and sometimes infamous names of people who own that property. I have no idea if Abraham and Mary are related to the freehold Springsteens, but I would guess they are. Who knows? And so when I knew the deed trail, I decided to look at old maps, and we were lucky again, we all are lucky, that the Coastal Survey, kind of the precursor to the Coast Guard Service, started taking maps and surveys of the coast every few years. And one of the earliest ones is this 1836 map. And I think you can see it, even though it's pretty remote here. This is the cove, of course, at Sandy Hook. And two things stuck out that I illustrate here for you. This was Island Beach. Okay. This is, 50 years after the battle. And then here is a notation that I'll show you what it says. It said House East Chimney on the northeastern side of Hartshorn's Woods. So that told me that from a Coastal Survey standpoint, that must have been a pretty prominent landmark, especially with a big east chimney, for them to note it. They also do, by the way, note something else I'll show you in a second. And a descendant of Eichharthorn over the years had sketched a house that looked, he thinks, like this in the Highland Hills here. And this house, of course, would have faced the bay. And so this would have been a very prominent eastern chimney in what may have been the original house here that was probably added onto over the years. Okay. And so, since it was the only thing in the early years of the 19th century of any height on this promontory, of course it would be a mariner's guide. So it was noted. Also, by the way, one of the owners of the Hartshorn property over the years was this guy, Nimrod Woodward, of all names, who is the man who in 1828 sells part of his property to what becomes the first of the twin lighthouses, not the ones we have today, here on the top of the hill. So clearly the survey people are saying there's two prominent things to look for if you come in this direction of our geography. There's a house with an east chimney and there's a lighthouse. So that was a really important clue. So over the time of my research course, the coast is changing. You can see here, once again, there's an inlet here between Island Beach, Sandy Hook, and the lower peninsula. Here's Hartshorn's Woods. A man named Woodward buys the property because Ethan Hartshorn dies in 1795. His daughter Elizabeth buys out the property, her, their half, basically this northern eastern half of the property from her brothers, marries a guy named Tylee Williams, who they two eventually sell in 1809 to Nimrod Woodward. And he, luckily for us, opens up the Woodward Hotel right there. And he opens it up in an old house, which was clearly Eichharthorn's old house, for two reasons. One, he can build it out into a hotel for visiting guests, and also because right at the foot of where that is was and still is a creek where he puts a landing. Now, this is a landing a little bit later on the other side of the Navesink, but it'll give you an indication of what he needed, because he wants to attract tourists down here. They can land here in this creek, probably ferried over by small boats, actually, and then they can walk up the steps to his hotel. So it all makes perfect sense. And you could also see in this map what is today Route 36 was the old Navesink Road, okay, on that side of the peninsula. So years go by, and another map, I think this is 1851, a guy named William Jones, Colonel William Jones, so-called, buys the property from Nimrod or his heirs. I forget which one, Woodward's heirs. Very prominent guy, well-to-do guy, sheriff of New York, spent his career in the military, and he buys the Woodward Hotel right here by Woodward's Landing, and a couple of interesting things show up here. But he expands the Woodward Hotel and he calls it the Navesink Hotel. And look what he's done to it. Now it's a very prominent place on this side of the peninsula. And he does it for a lot of reasons, one of which is the most obvious one: he wants to make money. But he also knows that toward the end of the pre-Civil War and then past the Civil War, Highlands is becoming a destination for rich New Yorkers and other people to come down to the shore. The other interesting thing in the map here is now, even though this is a contiguous peninsula, and when this map is drawn, look at all of this. This is shoal land, which means that the channel here, which has been dredged out a million times in the intervening years, would require ships coming down to dock here and then take their passengers by rowboat, little boats, into this inlet, okay, to get up to this house. That plays a prominent role in another story we'll talk about. But just to get you back down to 1777, here's Rocky Point. And the British, as we know, as I believe now, came up this way and attacked what was Hartshorn's house. Another map. On this map, we see very prominently William Jones Navesink House. That SH, by the way, is a schoolhouse designation. Here is Navesink. Here is now, this is the 1851 map, sorry. Here is the lighthouse up there. You can see Island Beach, okay, and you can see that the Navesink Hotel, as it's now being called, has that magnificent view of the harbor. Fast forward 10 years, William Jones House now prominent there. Again, you can see people are starting to promenade, I should say, populate Highlands on all sides and on this side as well. Now we have Scenic Peninsula, but something new pops up on this map, which I hope I'm going to illustrate here. Yes, I did. And what I'll go back now, what popped up here on this map, whoops, I'll go back, is that someone, when they drew this map, drew a dotted line from the Navesink, which is now Route 36 highway, in an L shape. And that was the biggest clue of all for me to determine where this house was. And to double check myself, the only other image in that time frame, a little bit later in the 19th century, is this image. And it's kind of foreshortened because Twin Lights is not that close as it appears. Twin Lights is down here. Of this very famous road, here you can see this ox cart going up the road, and here's another entrance. And the ox cart is about here going up that road. And this, as it turns out, are roads that you know well. And to check myself, on this map appears for the first time the house of James McGarry. This house is the oldest house in Highlands. It's right a little bit north of, actually northwest of OLPH, the Catholic Church there. The house still looks like that. And there's McGarry's house. So I knew that William Jones House Hotel in all its iterations were where I always suspected it was. Not in this drawing, but it would have been back here in these woods. Now, interesting also to our story is that in that time and place, the pretty much abandoned area down here in what is now Lower Highlands was called Witch Hollow. Keep that name in mind. Today, this is Linden Avenue right here and Water Witch Drive, which goes all the way from Route 36 past this little demarcation here all the way down into town. Up pops this guy, and he plays a prominent role in the story of the story. You all know James Fenimore Cooper for many reasons, okay? Turns out he was born in Burlington, New Jersey, and he becomes an author after a very brief career in the Navy. And he writes in 1830 the famous book, The Water Witch, or The Skimmer of the Seas. And oh, by the way, he writes it when he's in Italy. But because of the name and because of the previous association of Witch Hollow, and because the town fathers, and I use that word purposely, of an emerging little community in the Highlands, decide to capitalize on this publicity, they allege that he wrote it about Highlands, New Jersey. And this famous passage, which I'll read to you, in which one of the characters in the book say, "Thou seest, patroon, the spot of white on the opposite side of the bay, breezes and fanning, that is lust in rust, where cordial enters the mouth at every breath, and where a man has room to cast up the sum total of his thoughts any hour in the 24. And unless you think I'm salacious, lust in rust means pleasure in rest. It's a Dutch term because the character in the book is a Dutch patroon. But what the town fathers decide to do in the emerging Highlands is say, oh, we know what he did. John Fenimore Cooper was here in the Highlands and he saw this old ruin up in our hills of this famous hotel, and he modeled this resort called Lust and Rust after that. And so I questioned and found out that he didn't, I believe, use Woodward's Hotel as a model. First of all, he's in Fenimore. Cooper is, as far as I can tell, never ever come to Highlands. Never even in his Navy career came inside the bay where he might have seen the ruins of an old house up in the hill. But the story is just too convenient for the folks in Highlands to bypass. And the fact that they have a place called Witch Hollow blends in very nicely. And also the fact that James Fenimore Cooper, in fact, lived in the Highlands, but he lived in the Highlands region of Otsego, New York, up where Cooperstown is. You all know it probably today is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is. And that town happened to be named for his father. And so he spent his life up there, but all these more or less coincidences and deliberate uses of the names began to be legendary, and then people just took it as rote that, in fact, he described this particular place. And what they also do over the years is the folks in Highlands, God bless them, they take names from the Water Witch book and they incorporate them into streets in town. Barbary, Seadrift, and of course, famously Water Witch Avenue. So it's a brilliant kind of pre-internet marketing, if you would, that many people, including me growing up reading these stories, believed that, of course, J. Fenimore Cooper was here. And I haven't found any proof that he ever was. And if any of you have that, I will fall on my sword. Please send it to me. I wanted to find out exactly where that house had been because it had long gone the way of most things of that age, right? The house is built in the 1760s. So as Highlands is developing, here's a development map basically in 1866. And prominently, you see what is now called, after William Jones, Jones Creek. Okay. And this guy, who happens to be named Giles, is buying all this property and cordoning off and selling these property lots. But what was cool for me to find on this May 1866 map is right here, right down from, you see Navesink Avenue. This is now Linden. And this is, of course, Water Witch Avenue, which extends all the way down. This designation, it's saying boarding house. And look how it's canted. It's facing what would have been the bay. So two things jumped out at me because I grew up, as I said, in the Highlands during the summer, as you'll see in a minute. This Shore Drive, when I was a kid and up until, I forget, probably 40, 50 years ago, was a railroad track. It's now Shore Drive. At the time, it was Shore Road. Okay. And it becomes famous for a couple of reasons. Here again, as I mentioned, are Linden and Water Witch Avenue, which extends. The other thing that had happened over the years was all of this to the northeast, basically, mostly north side of what was then Shore Road and the railroad tracks later, was all landfilled as they were dredging the river up here, the northern Shrewsbury before it turns into the Navesink. They would take the dredge spoils and put it on land, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that Bay Avenue and Highlands still floods today, although they're working to fix that, because it's basically at sea level. Okay. And that brings up a couple of things. One of which, that story for another time that I think you all know, is that right in front virtually of that house in 1782, a very prominent hanging takes place. Okay, right there at the foot of Water Witch Avenue. But important to me, both as a researcher of this incident and also as a person who lived here, it turns out that in the 1950s, I lived right there, about a quarter of a mile from here, and I can prove it. I knew I'd at least get one laugh. That is me with the stupendous catch of a lifetime when I'm 12 years old, sartorially outfitted as I always am, looking my finest at a place called Gravelly Point Road, which is where my parents rented a bungalow. And it turns out that what I'm alluding to here is, of course, Joshua Huddy was hanged at what the British called Gravelly Point. Gravelly Point was the area of this entirety back in the 18th century. And by the time I came along and my parents rented bungalows here, The only thing left was what we called right here, Gravelly Point Road, where I am proudly displaying what became dinner that day. Um, and as a kid, when I would take my bike from here in the summers to go into town, right here, across from here, and there was again the railroad track here, was a little store where I would buy papers and donuts or whatever we were getting for breakfast in the morning. And I had to go through Huddy Park. And I'm sure I must have read the monument a few times in my youth, but I had no idea, A, what any of that meant, and B, that at one time something more prominent had happened up here in 1777. So that's my story, which I'm sticking to. Now, 1875 comes along, and the famous Eichharthorn House, which had been converted to the Woodward House and then the Navesink Hotel, and finally the Water Witch House, burns down. And here's an article describing it. And all that's left in a magazine article in Harper's Magazine is a sketch of these fireplaces. And even then, the legends has taken hold. It says ruins of lust in rust. And certainly, and I don't remember this, but if anybody that was alive when I was a kid in the Highlands would have talked about this, they would have said, oh, yeah, that's where lust in rust was, because that's how firmly this legend had set in. But this was the other chimney. Okay, and you can see that it had a ground floor chimney, then a second floor chimney. And it stood up there for many, many years, as did the chimney on the other side of the house, until a Dr. Fields, Everett Fields, took down the original, I believe, Eichharthorn chimney and reconstructed it here, and I don't know how accurate he was to how it had originally been, at his home in Highlands. And oh, by the way, these andirons and these works, of tools around this fireplace are still in the possession of the Highlands Historic Society, and I hope and believe that they may have come from the original Eichharthorn House. So, just to bring you back, this was the original house. This fireplace would have been that very prominent off picture here. And I think this is either a John King or a Randy Gabrielin book. I apologize to both if they're on. Is a picture of what would have been this fireplace inside. And of course, this would have been a two-story, at least, fireplace on that side of the house. So all things pointed to me in the direction of this being the house where the battle went. So, of course, I went there. Here's a thank you Google Earth picture of that. And I went there specifically in the hope that there might be a chance that we could do some, not me, people like Rich Veit might be able to do some archaeology. And so roughly plotted out some lines where I think the battle may have taken place. So the British would have come this way and possibly that way. And unfortunately, I found out two disturbing things. If that was their flanking lines to what would have been the house where the militia was. One is that across the street, and I played baseball here when I was a kid, is Kavusian Field. And when they put up Kavusian Field in 1947, as you might see in this article, they leveled that side of the hill, Monmouth Hills today on the Hartshorns Woods. And so any archaeological artifacts, which would probably only include musket balls. The British didn't have cannon or anything like that, or maybe they had dropped things, had long been displaced. And the other bad news was that on this side, all of this is now private property, and none of anything that would have looked like what it did up until at least 1875 would have been there. And so there was very little chance that any archaeology would reveal anything. Back up a little, give you another perspective. Linden Avenue, Waterwitch Avenue, that famous L, and you can see where Waterwitch Avenue takes a loop. Here is Shore Drive, which is where the old railroad track used to come. The bank here is down the road. Right about here was the Waterwitch Station when I was a kid. Up the other end, they had another station, railroad station up by Bars. Joshua Huddy was hanged right about there, not in Huddy Park. And the backstory to that is when Dana asked me to do another story, I'll tell you all about that. But as it turns out, the Eichharthorn House and its later hotel iterations are between where it was between today Rogers and Waddell Avenue. Here's Route 36 today. So when I went there, I took pictures, and right here, where that picture was taken on what is now South Linden Avenue, it's a pretty steep hillside here. You can see right there. Okay, so it's overgrown, and are there artifacts down there from the battle? Yeah, maybe, but it'd be hard to get to. I don't know who owns that property. Here's a series of condominiums. It also struck me as I was here this day last summer that when I was a kid, I would walk sometimes up to OLPH, go through Hartshorn's, or I should say Honey Park, cut through South Linden Avenue on the way up to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, having no idea because there's no marker or anything there to indicate that anything famous had ever happened. Where the original Eichharthorn and then the hotels is now right about here. So they're private homes or maybe condominiums, and there's little chance that there'll be any archaeology ever done there, which disappointed me, of course, and probably a lot of you who care about this kind of stuff. And through all of this, as you now know, through my investigations and working on the backs and shoulders of the people that had done a lot of writing before me, there's no trace that any of this ever happened. There was no trace when I was a kid. I assumed that after the fire in 1875, those ruins probably lasted long enough to become locally famous. And by sometime in the early 20th century, that was taken down and houses started to get built. As I mentioned, by the way, here's where Huddy was actually hanged, because this was all waterfront owing to the creek here, and it was all filled. And later on, around the 1929 timeframe, Highlands Township or Highlands Town bought this piece of land, moved the monument, which was originally here on the exact spot of Huddy's hanging, to where it is now right there. So that's a little bit up to date. So here's my question, Dana, for those who have asked or haven't asked questions up to this point, and I'll throw this open to anybody. Why isn't the Battle of Navesink in 1777 February remembered? And Dana, if you want to let people answer that question or open up a mic, I'll be glad to hear what they have to say.
Yeah, sure. I think everybody was just listening with rapt attention because we didn't get many questions, but that's because you're doing a good job of explaining everything, I would imagine.
Or I never shut up enough to take a break, one or the other.
No, it's perfect. Somebody's just asking where they can find this recording. I guess he wants to watch it again. So that's youtube.com/@MCHA1898. So I'm putting that in the chat for him. And all right, so everybody, why isn't the Battle of the Navesink remembered?
She can either turn on your microphone or she can read if you want to type in whatever's more convenient to you.
First of all, Rick, while we're waiting, amazing. I just think you did a phenomenal and outstanding job. I can't say enough about it. All right, Casper Veth, let's see. Ray, this is you, Ray.
It's Ray.
He said the reason is that only the victors write history.
He's
that
right.
Sounds good to me.
I am not the only young man, or I should say former young man, who played baseball at Kavusian Field. So did Ray Veth, and I'm assuming a lot of his siblings.
Oh, wow.
And he's exactly right. Okay. History is written by the winners. And in our revolutionary history, although that's about to change coming up on our 250th anniversary, more and more of this stuff is being uncovered. But this was a distinguishable route of the early Monmouth militia. They had successes later on, by the way. But you certainly don't want to celebrate the birth of your country saying that in 1777 we lost a major battle or a skirmish, depending on how you want to look at it. Secondly, and this is interesting to me, and I don't know why, and it may be me, I can't find any after-battle reports that the British wrote, and I know they would have. And I've looked at least online, at the archives in the British Library, although they suffered a cyber attack a couple of months ago, which has disabled a lot of their online research. But I went over to England specifically to look for things, and I couldn't find any after-action report. I just want to believe it's there. But certainly on this side of the Atlantic, we weren't advertising it. The Monmouth militia, what little of it there was left, had to regroup over the next few years, which they did. And they fought successfully, although not, believe it or not, at the Battle of Monmouth. Other militias participated in that. The Battle of Monmouth, our Monmouth militia was kind of a blocking force to the east of the battle. Joshua Huddy, by the way, catches up with some of the British later on after the actual Battle of Monmouth, but they were not there. But they did create havoc and battle the British from the British vantage point at Sandy Hook that they took over in 1777 as well. So thank you for that question and answer, Ray. Anybody else have a thought about this?
It says, Catherine said perhaps the records on the loyalists have disappeared.
So that's a really, really interesting observation. I don't know. I mean, there are records, and in fact, Dana works with them every single day out at Freehold, and certainly at the Monmouth Archives in Manalapan, and the Alexander Library in Rutgers, let's say, and probably in Princeton's library as well. There are records of loyalty fighters, but not a lot. Okay, and most of them have been picked over quite a bit, including by me, for a couple of reasons. Except again for the officers who tended to come from the moneyed class and the well-connected class. The average militiaman was a yeoman farmer who worked almost as kind of a pickup volunteer, although they were paid on a short-term basis. I don't know how many of them were literate, not all of them. For instance, I have yet to come across, except in lawsuits, anything that Joshua Huddy himself ever physically wrote. But most of these men were protecting hearth and home, and they were doing the militia stuff when they could. Their superior officers would write up some of these. But if I'm David Foreman or Nathaniel Scudder, who dies, by the way, in 1780 at Black Point, if I'm these guys, I don't know that I'm going to spend a lot of time writing about a defeat where my men flee or get captured. And if I do, I'm not going to make it this glorious encounter. So I think that's obviously another very good observation of why we don't have a lot of those records. Oh, by the way, we don't have a lot of records from a lot of people because of the literacy rate in colonial America was not all that high. So, unless we come across, and occasionally we do, and they're finds, journals or letters that people have in their families, most of the sources have been well known. Even Murray Hyde, which she was writing, describes things that her relatives are talking about. I can't recall an instance where she says, here's a letter from my great-grandfather, although she may have done that as well. So what else do we have from our audience, Dana?
No, just a lot of congratulations and saying it's great. I always enjoy your presentations, lots of nice things. Paul is asking, could this have been a surprise because the militia were not expecting an attack during such bad weather?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. So they're like everybody else. Wherever they are at Eichharthorn's house, I'm sure they're crammed into this little house, as many of them as could be. And, we know there's about 100 of them. The rest of them are probably outside in, who knows, lean-tos, tents, whatever they could afford. And they're trying to stay warm, similar to what Washington did at Valley Forge all those years later. And they're not looking outside, and they're thinking, there's no way the British are going to come up here. So that's one thing that they got caught off guard on. And the British, as we know, were a little bit more hardy and more, you might even say, reckless, but they did use the element of surprise and also kind of came from a wholly different direction. And the reports that we do have say that they came up trudging through the woods before they get to the house. I am certain that if you want to brave the ticks and everything else up there, that if you took a metal detector, make sure you would report to the National Park Service if you do this, that there are probably things that those British troops left in those woods that cold, bitter night that they're, trying to surprise the militia. but they did pretty overwhelmingly. So yeah, weather, time of year, all of those factors combined to create this situation. What else we have, Dane?
I think that's about it. Does anybody else have any more questions? As you can see up on the screen, we've got two of Rick's wonderful books, Hidden History of Monmouth County, and then also one that we use in the research library, Stories of Slavery in New Jersey. So that's a good one. You can get those on Amazon, correct?
You can get them on Amazon. You can write to me. That's my email. I've got them. I think some occasionally they're in Barnes and Nobles, and I'm going to give you sometimes, and I'm going locally at least, and I'm going to give you a little news here. Next year, 2025, I'm going to be publishing a book whose title I'm not going to tell you because I don't know what it is yet. About Joshua Huddy and Colonel Ty. A couple of people that are very, very important to what went on in Monmouth County, of which a lot of stories have been written, some of which are not true.
So Rick, I'm going to tell you, you have the connection to Huddy in the Highlands, and I have a connection to Huddy here in my neighborhood, actually. I think my neighborhood is where Philip White went running into when he jumped off the cart. I found an old map.
We shall be talking about that, and we'll titillate everybody else because Philip White plays a very important part of this. And oh, by the way, Dana and her colleague Joe Zemla at the Monmouth County Historic Association actually allowed me to hold in my little hands the original key from the front door to Joshua Huddy's house.
Isn't that cool?
Close as I'll ever get to him.
Oh, the nerdery.
Oh, the nerdery, yes. But I'm sure everybody on this call would have loved to do that or might still want to do it. And all you got to do is dial Dana and make an appointment at the library. And by the way, I'm sure Dana would say this. I think it's by appointment only, Dana, correct me if I'm wrong. But the resources in Freehold at 70 Court Street are unique. They continue to add to our history. They've got collections and books and manuscripts, some of which I showed you tonight, that are beyond belief, including everything that the Hartshorns ever wrote on a piece of paper, because they saved everything. True. So those of you who want to research and write, which I hope are virtually all of you, that's the place to go. So give Dana a call and she'll help you there.
All right. Well, I think that's about it. Let's just see. Diana Burton said we should donate. Yes, you should. Thank you so much, Diana.
Please do. And by the way, let me give you a pitch. And this, Dana didn't know I was going to say this, but I will. You probably know that that's a private organization. And aside from some grants that they get occasionally, the Monmouth County Historical Association has been preserving our history for how many years? 100 and how many, Dana?
25.
125 years. And they depend on fundraising and membership. And what is the current membership rate for old people like me?
I think it might be $25.
Well worthwhile.
Yeah.
Gets you access to all of their facilities, of course. But more importantly, it helps them do a tremendous number of exhibits. The current exhibit is what now?
Okay, so we have Highlights, which is actually 125 years of some of our best stuff. That's at 70 Court Street in Freehold. We also, of course, have the exhibit at Marlpit Hall in Middletown, which is really wonderful. Definitely don't want to miss that. That's like a semi-permanent exhibit, but definitely something to see.
And that's called, by the way, Beneath the Floorboards. And it's about enslaved people that lived in Middletown with the Taylor and extended family. And it'll knock your socks off when you go see that exhibit. What are the hours of that? What hours of that is that open in Marlpit?
So Marlpit Hall is open Friday through Sunday from 1 to 4. And the main museum at 70 Court Street, that's open 1 to 4 Wednesday through Saturday. And we just opened Hoven House, which a lot of people remember. That was a big trip for the kids many years ago with the hearth cooking, and did so much to the interior of that house. It's amazing. It's sparkling and the floors are shining, and we have some really great stuff in there as well. So definitely come to Covenhoven House. That's Fridays from 1 to 4. By the way, if anybody would like to volunteer to be house guides or docents, that would be tremendous, because the reason we can only have Covenhoven open on Fridays is because we just don't have the volunteer corps. So please contact us if you're looking for something special to do. It really is a special thing. I was a docent for years before I became an employee.
And I'll tell you what I'll do. And if this is not legal, please tell me, Dana. Anybody who sends a note to Dana at her email or calls her tomorrow, whichever, to become a member of the Historical Association, I will, for an additional $15, get you a signed copy of one of these books, whichever you want. As long as you acknowledge that you were on this call and you want to join. And that way, I feel like PBS, you get this double dip here.
That's so nice. Very nice. Thank you so much, Rick. Appreciate that.
Okay.
All right. So everybody, if you have any questions, I know some people still want the YouTube address, just email me. I'm dhowell@monmouthhistory.org. You can find it on the website.
Howell Township is named
his
after
email's right
Dana,
there.
of course.
What's that?
That Howell Township was named after you, of course.
Of course. It's mine. All right, everybody. Thank you, Rick. Wonderful presentation.
Thanks again, everybody. Thanks
Have a
for
good
spending
night.
time. Okay, Dana, we'll talk to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.